Hello, thank you for taking a few brief minutes to think through how to read your STAR data and how you can use that data to inform your practice. By this point, most of us are probably pretty familiar with the STAR test, but let's just recap a few quick points before getting started. The STAR assessment is a short reading test that provides teachers with data. STAR tests are computer adaptive, which means they adjust to each answer a student provides. How are we using the STAR test at Vernon Hills High School? In a typical year, all freshmen through junior students will take the STAR test 3 times a year in their English classes as a progress monitoring tool. Of course, we know that this wasn't a traditional year in many ways, so we didn't quite reach those 3 data points, but we are using the test now. Should I talk to my students about their STAR score? If you are a non-English teacher, you do not need to discuss the STAR scores with your students. Non-English teachers can use the STAR scores to simply inform their practice, but English teachers will communicate with their students about their STAR scores. A few words of caution before we dive into your STAR data. The first is we want to be sure that we avoid a deficit mindset, using the STAR data to focus in on what our students cannot do or seeing them as incapable readers, as opposed to simply using the data as a snapshot of some ways that a student might need some additional support to be successful in your class. So dwelling on their potential and not their deficits. Another thing to think about is the way that the STAR test might come across for a linguistically and culturally diverse student. The STAR test is a pretty traditional reading assessment, which means it's assessing traditional literacy ability that is pretty rooted in European types of literacy. This might mean that our students who are from linguistically and culturally diverse backgrounds might be overrepresented in the intervention level area. This might mean that our students do need some support, but it's also really important that we acknowledge the literacy strengths that those students do bring to the classroom that might not be measured in a more traditional literacy assessment like the STAR test. Another thing to think about is long-term groupings and how the STAR test is simply one data point in time and not something that is meant to create fixed groups for any enduring amount of time in your classroom. You want to be sure to pay attention to updated STAR data as it comes, and also to use data that is specific to your classroom and all the great formative assessments that you use to assess students in skills that are more specific to your class to help inform kind of fluid and flexible groupings as the year goes on. And lastly, the STAR test simply measures general reading skills. It is not measuring discipline-specific skills. So all those skills that students need to be able to read in your math or social studies or science class, those are not going to come across in your student's STAR score. So a student who might appear as a very capable reader from their STAR score might struggle in your class because of the discipline-specific tasks that you're asking students to engage with. So just some words of caution. The STAR test is simply one data point. It gives us a snapshot. It can be useful, but there are certainly limitations, and we want to be cognizant of those as we use the STAR test to serve our students. So a quick note about opening and organizing your STAR data. You can either open from the link that was emailed to you, or if you want to use the bit.ly here on the screen, VHSTAR 2021, you can access a Google Doc, which is a launch point for all of our school STAR data. From there, you'll select your department or area focus. There's a miscellaneous tab that includes case managers, counselors, etc. So find wherever whatever area is most pertinent to you. Once you've got your Google Sheet open for your department or area, you'll use the tabs at the bottom to navigate to your class or caseload. So look for your last name there. I would encourage you to make a copy or copy and paste your data into a new Google Sheet so that you can organize your data per class. Right now, all of your classes are on one page. So if you want to organize your classes so that you can have clear groupings, you're going to be mixing them all up by class period. So it'll be easier if you create a Google Sheet that looks like this one, where each tab has a different class period, because then you're able to organize by percentile ranking or intervention level by class period. And it'll be much easier to use the data that way. So go ahead and consider making a copy of your data and organizing it by class period before you proceed. All right, once you have your STAR data opened and organized however you'd like it, I'm going to want to look at a few things to help you understand your data. The first is the grade equivalent. The grade equivalent is a norm reference score that references how a student's test performance compares with other students nationally. So for example, a 5th grade student with a grade equivalency of 7.6 performs as well as a typical 7th grader after 6 months of the school year. You'll notice that for your data, it is a max grade equivalency, which means the scores have simply been rounded up for anything of 0.5 or higher. So they're just whole grade levels as opposed to broken down by point in the school year. Grade equivalencies can be nice reference points, but again, we want to be really careful about that deficit mindset creeping in here and thinking, oh wow, my students, reading at the 7th grade reading level, what kind of capability can they have in my class? Simply use it as a snapshot that gives you a little bit of reference point, but um, try not to proceed with that deficit mindset. The other and perhaps more pertinent data point would be that percentile rank. The percentile rank is a measure of a student's ability compared to other students in the same grade nationally. Of course, we know how percentile rank works, right? You can score anywhere from 1 to 99, and it simply tells you what percentage of students at your grade level have you scored higher than. And that can be a nice percentile, can be a nice data point to use. It's a little bit less um, it has a little bit less implications than the grade equivalent one, and it just is a helpful way to kind of rank your students in your class for the purposes of differentiation. Let's talk a little bit about the normalized percentile rankings here at Vernon Hills High School. Obviously, we're working at a rigorous school that has some pretty capable students, and so our percentile rankings might might skew a little bit from the national rankings as we try to make sense of them. So a couple things to look at. We set our own benchmarks here at Vernon Hills High School. And so if you look on the left, you'll see how we have set our benchmarks. So 40th to 100th percentile at Vernon Hills High School is considered at or above benchmark. That might look different at different schools where the cutoff point might be a little bit lower. From there, you can kind of see it goes down. 25 to 39 percentiles on watch, 10 to 24 is in the intervention range, and 0 to 9 is urgent intervention. So you can kind of see that color coding system and how that tells you the level of intervention that a student may need. And just to give you a little bit more localized context, at Vernon Hills High School, 0 to 40th percentile might mean that a student needs a little bit of additional support. So they may need an additional literacy intervention in the form of a literacy class or some kind of in-class intervention that may be up to the mainstream teacher to provide. 40th percentile or higher gives us a general indication that a student might be able to be independently successful in a college preparatory level class. 60th percentile or higher kind of gives us that same indication at an AP or honors level class, and a student might have a little bit more independent success there. These are very gross generalizations, and of course there's exceptions and all sorts of variables to consider when trying to understand the level of support our students need, but it's sometimes helpful just to have general ranges and reference points as we try to understand the students in our classroom and how we might best serve them. So that gives you a little bit of localized information. So you're looking at your data right now and you're noticing lots of columns and lots of different pieces of information. I'm just going to focus you in on a couple things that I think are probably the most useful to pay attention to. The first is that intervention column. That will simply tell you if your student is receiving a literacy intervention. That might be helpful to know simply because you might notice, oh wow, a student's in an intervention range, and to notice that they are receiving a literacy intervention can be helpful because it can give you information that they're getting additional reading support outside your classroom, and it can also give you a contact person that you might touch base with to support the student further. You might communicate to that literacy teacher some things you're doing in class or how that class might better support your student, and so that can just be a nice additional support area for a student who might need it. The second thing to look at is this benchmark column. You can see those colors that we just referenced on the last slide. So that gives you kind of just a quick color-coded way to break down your students, whether they're in urgent intervention red, intervention yellow, on watch, or green, which is at or above benchmark. So this can be a helpful way if you're maybe trying to group your students in homogeneous groups. This can be just a nice way to organize your data because you just have quick groupings that are created. Another thing to take a look at is that grade level. Remember, we're looking at the max grade equivalency, so it's rounded up. And again, we want to be cautious about that deficit mindset as we look at the grade level of the readers in our classroom. And I think, again, the most useful piece of information is just that percentile ranking, because it just gives you a quick snapshot of where your student is and how they're performing in relation to other students of the same age. So of all the data on your spreadsheet there, those are probably the 4 that I would pay the most attention to and the 4 that I would use to help inform your service of your students. So talking about the service of your students, how do you go about using reading data like this to help support the students in your classroom? There's kind of 2 schools of thought around literacy instruction at the high school level. And that sort of breaks down to leveled reading, meaning students are getting text at their specific reading level, or text complexity, meaning we're going to give students complex text and help them perform well at that level. And the good news I think that high school teachers can hear is that research has not been supportive of the idea that we need to teach students at their reading level at high school. The exception is for beginning readers. So, grade 1 through 3 readers can benefit from leveled text. But at high school, we're not asking teachers to, find leveled textbooks and leveled text for every lesson. Certainly seems a little bit unrealistic for the range of readers that we have in our class. But there are studies that show that students can learn from harder texts, at least when they receive adequate instructional support. So we don't necessarily need to differentiate text type and give students level text, but we probably do need to differentiate in terms of the instructional support that we're offering students. We have this range of readers in our classroom. We understand from the STAR data and other measures that we are using that we need to support our students in different ways, and this is probably going to require a differentiated level of instructional support. So while it may be appropriate to adjust reading levels for some purposes, on occasion you may decide to do that, it is clear that high school teachers need to expose students to complex texts and support them as they do so. Taking a student in the intervention range and never exposing them to a complex text is doing that student a disservice. Instead, we do want to expose students to complex text, but we want to make sure to accompany that with high-level scaffolding and support. Okay, so you're looking at your data and you're noticing, wow, I have some kids in my class who are at the intervention or urgent intervention range. What do I do with that? How do I use this data to help inform my practice? So there's some different routes you can go, right? You can create purposeful groupings, sometimes heterogeneous. If you want a mixed, you have a mixed group where maybe there's a pretty capable reader who can, be assigned a certain role and help lead students through a task. Maybe homogeneous groupings are more appropriate, where you want to have students with other students who are similar reading level, and then you can target the instruction that way. And that allows for planning differentiated lessons to be a little bit easier, because now you're just differentiating by group and not by individual student. You might provide scaffolds for students at the intervention level. Perhaps there are a few students in your class who really do need an additional scaffold. There's all sorts of ways that you can support them with the same literacy task in your classroom, but just by adding a scaffold or two that might help them be successful. And seek support in meeting the needs of the students at the intervention level. I mentioned earlier, maybe reaching out to their literacy teacher. You also can seek out the support of your instructional coaches. If you're wondering, how can I best support these students with the tasks that I'm asking them to engage with in my classroom, reach out to us using that email address there, and we'll work with you. We'll look at the curriculum, we'll look at the assessment, we'll look at the data, and we'll work with you to help create some literacy supports that can ensure all students are successful in your classroom. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful in breaking down the data and thinking a bit about what to do with it. Please don't hesitate to reach out for further support.